Church, the best part of this video is that there's a hobbit between Peter and I.
Hey, True Day family, welcome back to some more of our digital content. A few weeks back, we started this series following an article called 5 Essential C's of the Church, just helping us understand what is the church and what isn't the church. And we've so far looked at the ideas of community, we looked at the ideas of confession, and now we're going to pick up with the third C, which is corporate. So, Josh, do you want to define what do we mean the church is corporate?
Yeah, so when we talk about the church being corporate, the Bible talks about there being defined organizational roles within the church. So pastors, elders, overseers, deacons, as well as corporate roles that we fill inside of the body, like leaders, teachers. So that's kind of what we mean as when we talk about the church being corporate.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the idea of an institution, right, that has defined roles and authority and structure, and a lot of people, I think today, think that that's automatically a negative. That, institution, institution sounds like
I don't want structure in my church.
Yeah. Sounds like I'm being institutionalized or like, I mean, it's just, it seems cold. It seems... like even the idea of corporate, like a corporation, this soulless corporation, and sometimes you hear people talk about that, like, the church is just a business, or, they got all these rules. But I think, and sometimes there's the impression that, hey, the perfect church was, of course, the Acts 2 church. I mean, they weren't a perfect church. If you read the book of Corinthians, the early church wasn't perfect. But they are the model of the church. And so there's sometimes this perception that, hey, the Acts 2 church was this, sort of beautifully organic. I mean, there was just, everything just sort of flowed and happened. But no, they had problems, and they had leaders, and there was spiritual authority, and there was even elements of institutional life. So Acts chapter 6, right? This is shortly after, this is very early on. There's 3,000 people in the church right away. Acts 2, the apostles are preaching, they're being bold, they're confronting the Jewish authorities that tell them to stop preaching, but they keep preaching. And then it says in Acts chapter 6, they need more help. There's things going on in the church, there's conflict in the church, they need to structure some things better in the church. So they say, hey, brothers and sisters, select from among yourselves 7 men of good reputation, full of the Spirit and wisdom, who we can appoint to these duties that they discussed. And so they chose Stephen and several others. So you just think about that. It's a very short couple verses there, but what goes into the church selecting these leaders? So then we get into, well, who's a part of who can have a hand in helping select? Well, who are the actual members of the church? Who's a part of the church? That's kind of where the idea of church membership comes from, that we got to have sort of bona fide members of the church that have that authority and role of selecting who these people are going to be. You had, how do we determine that there are people that are full of the Spirit and wisdom? How do we decide that? How do we determine that these people are qualified to be in leadership? And so I think that the idea of authority, institution, kind of even having officers and leaders, and as much as people, I think, in our day and age back away from that, because we have a very anti-establishment kind of culture, anti-institutional culture. You hear political candidates. Every political candidate says, I'm an outsider. I'm not one of them. I'm not part of the establishment. I'm gonna come in and set the establishment right. We don't like established authority, right? So I think that speaks more to our human nature than anything else. Back to me.
One of the things I've been thinking about as I've considered this is, I think one of the reasons that we push back against church leadership is we've seen bad examples of church leadership. But the Apostle Paul in 1 Timothy chapter 3, he goes through the qualifications of what a leader should be. So he says that an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, self-controlled, sensible, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not an excessive drinker, not a bully, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not greedy, and on and on and on. So he lists all of these out. And so I think one of the benefits of the corporate nature of the church is there are people that can look at these qualifications and say, that person is qualified or that person's not qualified according to the standard that Scripture sets out for us.
Yeah. And it's a high bar. Like when you look at the things that he's asking, like it's like, oh yeah, this seems pretty reasonable, but like not quarrelsome, like not gossiping, not like it even talks about like you have to have your own house in order. Sensible, respectable, hospitable, able to teach. You have to know people to know if they qualify. So there's an element of I have to be connected enough to the people of my church to know who I am going to want in leadership. And then with that, you have to know what is their gifting. Like, you don't want me as your church treasurer. Trust me. I don't do math well. That's not one of my strong suits. But then knowing how each person can act and interact within their gifts for the benefit of the body, and knowing that, like, God has called us to steward this church, but then each of us might have a different role within that. And so some people are going to be more administrative. Some people are going to be more boots on the ground. And we need everything in between.
Yeah. And I think what you guys are saying is so important because there's kind of, you said boots on the ground, but there's real grassroots involvement of those leaders within the body, within the local church, where they are being held accountable. So accountability is huge. And the accountability goes both ways, both the leaders being accountable, but also the leaders being able to lead in such a way as to, shepherd people and hold them to account as well. And so I think that's another thing too. Sometimes we just don't like the accountability. Maybe that's why we shrink away from the idea of an institution, because I don't know that I want the accountability. Both, and I think both leaders do this. There are a lot of leaders that like to, for example, hey, I'm going to go plant a church, and the church is going to be run. I'm going to be on the board along with all the staff I hire are going to be the board. And that's literally, like, there are churches that have had major scandals where that was the case. Like, who's the board? Who's supposed to be holding everyone accountable? Well, the pastor's on the board, and then the people that all that pastor hired are also the board and making all the decisions. And so, wait, who's holding who? Isn't this a conflict of interest kind of thing? So I think that's another reason I hope that people kind of bounce back and the pendulum swings a little bit more back to the idea of, no, we need institutions, we need guardrails, we need authority and accountability, because we've seen so many examples, right, of situations where it's like, and you could totally see it coming, from the Ravi Zacharias to the Mark Driscolls to the Brian Houstons, and obviously every person is capable of falling into sin, but I think you look at those situations, and there was an extreme lack of accountability, extreme lack of any sort of church discipline or a church structure, institutional kind of structure. And hey, when it's good, it's good. But when it goes bad, there's no one to sort of
It goes real bad.
Account. Yeah,
and not only is it moral guardrails, but truth or theological guardrails. So, like, these structures exist to avoid heresy. And in Acts 15, we see some people who come into the church. They're teaching something that they think is true, but it takes a council of Jerusalem to, like, sit down, and they utilize reason, they utilize tradition, they utilize the scripture that they had at that point. They actually quote both Amos and Isaiah, and they're just like, what is the truth, and how can we make sure that we live according to that truth? But then within that council, they seem to turn to James, and James seems to make the final declaration, and then they send these letters out to the other churches. And so you kind of see this hierarchy, but it's not like James is sitting up here making whatever choice he wants. There's some debate, there's discussion, and then he leads them as a group to say what is truth and how can we make sure the churches adhere to truth.
One encouragement I would have for people is whether you're a part of our church or maybe you're attending a different church right now, like get involved in some way, shape, and form in the institutional life of the church. Get involved, become a formal member, where you have a role in selecting leaders from among yourselves. Get involved in the life of, if it's a part of a denomination, get involved in the denominational life of the church, and because you have the ability to affect what's happening and to encourage greater collaboration between churches and church planting, and there's so many different opportunities. And I think rather than viewing the institution or the greater organization of something as the thing that's going to kill a movement, maybe we can begin to really, if we get involved and if we put our hands to the structure that God's given us, we can see fruit coming through it.
Yeah. How's my hair? Ooh, getting a little thin. Peter, however, that guy's got a good head of hair.
Shampoos with Rogaine. I don't know if you want me to keep doing the introductions or if one of you wants to introduce one.
You do the introductions,
Okay.
Brian.
It's my specialty. I introduce and then I'm just going to fade into the background.
Then you can go off frame.
I'll just climb on the table.
Should I sit up as tall as I possibly can?
I'll slouch. You guys can both.
Church, the best part of this video is that there's a hobbit between Peter and I.
I like to think I'm more of a dwarf with the beard, but
He'd like to show his hairy toes, but we told him not to.
I mean, there's camera right now. There's not.
Join a church.
And how do you do that at Trinity?
Come to a Next Steps class.
So the next date on screen right here.
Shameless plug.
It's not shameless.
All right, let's go to number 4.
Okay.